Oh, a puzzle. Nice.
Welcome back. Good to see so many friends joining us after eating lunch and hopefully enjoying the weather outside. And maybe I heard rumors of dolphin in the creek. So a perfect day, really. We are excited to be back. If you notice, there are now cookies. So if you start to hit a midday lull, we have some cookies available for you. And I have gluten-free cookies. I did include some other gluten-free snacks in there as well. So there are gluten-free, dairy-free muffins that are over there too. So please enjoy. With that, we are going to get started again with our 2 o'clock talk, which is watching whales in the Middle Ages, presented by Dr. Vicki Szabo, who is a professor of ancient, medieval, and environmental history at Western Carolina University and author of Monstrous Fishes in the Mead Dark Sea. Her current research project focuses on medieval Icelandic whale exploitation using evidence from archaeology, history, and ancient DNA. She is also working on a book focusing on medieval wildlife with a special focus on whales and other sea mammals. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Szabo. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's what I want to hear. Now, every cookie you go get, somebody bring me a cookie too. This was supposed to be a dramatic video of the black sand beaches of Iceland, which are beautiful places to go visit. The video isn't working. Oh, I got half a cookie. Um, the video isn't working, but I wanted to show it because it represents the coastal erosion that Iceland is undergoing massively, uncontrollably at all times on all coasts. And that's kind of where the project that I'm talking to about to you today started. So I study medieval North Atlantic whaling, and I study North Atlantic whaling from about the Iron Age in Scotland, 200 BCE, to about 1700 CE. So it's a giant swath of time. I'm lucky to work in Scotland and parts of Greenland, a little bit in Norway and the Canadian Maritimes, but the core of our work is in Iceland. And I learned last time I spoke here that as long as I show pictures of Iceland, people will be happy. So you're going to see lots of beautiful pictures of Iceland. The site I work on is on the Skagafjörður Peninsula. It's called Hopnir, and it is very remote, which says a lot for Iceland. Iceland has a lot of very remote places. This is, and it's directly east of the west, I forgot the pointer doesn't work, directly east of the West Fjords, that westernmost peninsula, which is incredibly wild. So anything that swims up around the western coast of Iceland will eventually drift over to our site at Hopnir, which is really sort of critical. So a series of bays, you see where Hopnir is there. There's a very lovely farmer right in this little red house here. He farms eider ducks. So when we went to go work on the site, you hear this constant cooing of eider ducks, which is just really lovely. 3 scalloped bays, which are incredibly rough. They don't look particularly bad here. And this is from a drone's eye view. So we started working at this site in 2022. A farmer, the lovely eider duck farmer, told local archaeologists that whale bone was falling out of the beachhead. So archaeologists went to go examine it. I'm going to show you a series of slides over the last 3 years. So that is Hopnir in 2023. When I visited it, you can already see that there's some grassy surface that's eroding. This is the erosion surface right here. And this is the excavation site itself. So rescue archaeologists went in 2022. A very nice woman who leads an all-woman team at Hopnir, who are wonderful, completely strong, and they remind me a lot of this right whale crew that we're going to hear from later. She told us, we think we have a whalebone workshop. And I thought, okay, lots of people say that. Lo and behold, everywhere you look on the site, whalebone of all different sizes, worked and unworked, is just falling out of these erosion faces. So our crew, who are made up of biologists and historians and folklorists and various archaeologists, went up to the site and we started gathering samples. So these are all the samples from pretty raw whalebone to really highly worked examples. And it goes on and on from 2022 up until 2025 as they went lower in the archaeological site. So we get full ribs, we get full vertebra in 2025. They work their way all the way across the peninsula and expose the entirety of this series of booths and little boat nousts, a really complicated seasonal site. So men and women would have traveled here from all across Iceland to engage in this very specialized craft. And we think that they were here from about 930 CE up until the 1600s. So that is the site as it was nearing completion. You see one of the archaeologists taking a lunch break over there to get a sense of the scale of the site itself. In the last year, more and more whalebone, and it's got delicate little scratches, came up. These are just two examples. I have no idea what this one is. And if anyone knows what this is, we've been calling it a bottle opener because that's kind of what it looks like. And I like the idea of Viking Age people having bottle openers. So what this site is a seasonal occupation site where they may or may not have taken whales. They may have collected whales as they drifted past from other people in the West Fjords. And they ended up producing a whole bunch of objects that look like this. Every time we opened up a new box of whalebone from the archaeologists, we got these long shapes, some of them with perforations, some of them a little bit bigger than others, but what we think these are blanks or tools in production. These are all archaeological whalebone tools, various clamps, weaving swords, fishing net needles. So we think we've got this export site where whalebone tools are being crafted, and it's kind of a needle in a haystack site. There's nothing else like it in the medieval world. I wanted to show you today, which I didn't show you last year, other examples of whale use from Iceland from the Middle Ages to the 19th century or so. Whalebone chairs, we read about this in medieval records. A fishing or net needle, the paddle is absolutely spectacular. I'm not sure how it functioned, but it's a beautiful object. It's called a sailing needle. That one is really interesting because it has initials on it. And I'll come back to why those initials matter later on. The handle of a hammer, and then this amazing piece. You can kind of guess what it is through the reconstruction, somebody's window. So in a turf hut or a small fisherman's hut, they use this big solid piece of whalebone in which they put a really precious material for these very extraordinarily poor Icelanders. And I was connecting with both David and with Keith this morning. I'm going to talk to you about a region with a lot of cetacean biodiversity and a place with a lot of extraordinary poverty. The people who were working this whalebone relied on these animals for food, for fuel, for raw materials. When Keith said baleen was the plastic of early America, whalebone was the plastic of the Middle Ages. So it's just an extraordinary raw material. So what our project has been doing since 2015 is surveying archaeological sites across the North Atlantic to figure out how whales were used. So this involves us going into labs. When I tell my students I'm going to Iceland, they think I'm going to go have fun and see things and hang out with Vikings, and I just do this. I'm in labs drilling whale bones. It's very boring. But what we learned from these whale bones and what we learned from the site of Hopnir, this whalebone workshop, is they are very specific in the whales they're selecting to use. This is not what we expected at all. And I should mention that when this project started, we knew virtually nothing about how whales were used in Iceland, especially economically in the Middle Ages. That's Balenidae. So these results that you're looking at, we have Balenidae, we have blue whales, 26 samples apiece identified through something called collagen analysis, looking at the protein in the bone. Collagen can't distinguish between a bowhead whale and a right whale. Everything else we know is telling us they were probably using right whales. We also had 3 walrus from the site, 2 gray whales, which was pretty interesting since gray whales are gone up there now, a couple of humpback whales and a fin whale. But this heavy reliance on Balenidae, probably right whales and blue whales, tells us that they may be specifically choosing these animals, which means they're hunting them, they're selecting them. So in all of the sites that we've surveyed, we've worked at about 13 sites in northern Iceland. We found about 13 or 14 different species, which is more or less what we expected to find. These are all of our sites. What we didn't expect to find, and the data-heavy sites end here. I'm going to start showing you lots of strange-looking pictures of medieval whales. But what all of our data, about 200, 250 whale bones that we've sampled all told, what all of these bones tell us is this dark blue color, everybody is using blue whales more. And this is not what we thought would be happening with a peasant culture in the Middle Ages. We thought they'd be using whatever washed ashore, but they're very specifically selecting blue whales. So how did they do this? That's one of the first questions we've been working on. Our latest group of samples from Hopnir, which isn't shown on this map, this is from a new publication that we're working on. We're not done with Hopnir yet. We had 120 whale bones stuck in customs for a year. So in that period when we were waiting for this customs approval and this CITES approval for whalebone happened, we shifted our attention to another question. So this is our site. This is a picture of whales from the right whale from the 17th century. And that's a reconstruction of what our site might have looked like. We thought, well, Vicki, your sources aren't in customs. So why don't you go back and use your historical sources and figure out the people who were living in this site, what did they know about whales? What did they think about the whales that they were using? And this is something that David can answer through oral histories. So David has generations of people whose fathers worked with whalebone and worked with whales, I should say. We don't have that sort of evidence from the Middle Ages, so we engaged in this thought exercise. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk about how medieval people knew about whales. When Keith was talking this morning, I was amazed because he mentioned toothed and baleen whales as though that's just axiomatic. Everybody knows toothed and baleen whales. It's not until the 13th century that medieval people recognized that difference. Like the Carteret County emblem, people thought whales were giant fish. So we have all these similar ideas between what Keith was talking about, but also what David was talking about today. These local people who are using these animals, between where I study in Iceland and what David studies on this coast, I've got a difference of 600 years, but that's about it. They're very similar ideas over this span of time. So what I want to talk about is the sources of knowledge on whales. When I first started studying whales, I knew them from books. I can't go out on the sea. I get super seasick. I can't go see whales in real life. So I rely on experts. Medieval people did just what I do. They read in books, they relied on experts, and they also, if they were lucky enough, got to see whales themselves. So up on the screen you have, from the south to the north, varying levels of expertise about whales. We have Roman authors, where I'm going to start, and then we have this idea called the bestiary tradition. That's monstrous whales. And that's probably what most European people thought whales were. Big, horrible monsters sent by God to punish sin. And then we have two scientists, Saint Albertus, and Olaus Magnus. And I'll come back to them. They use the words of ancients, but also expert resources, fishermen. Fishermen who would go out opportunistically when they saw a whale, bring it ashore, no matter what kind of whale it was. They become these coastal populations that are these dots in yellow. They become the main means by which knowledge progresses about whales over this massive period of time that I study. And finally, these two northern people. The Kingsmere, it's a book produced by an author whose name we don't know. He worked at the court of the King of Norway, and he wrote a remarkable book about all the whales of northern waters. And then John the Learned. I'm going to save saying anything about John the Learned until closer to the end of the talk. He is the most remarkable human being I've ever read about. And he knew more about whales than anybody I've ever met. No offense to anybody here, sorry. For someone who was a peasant, who was in exile and never went to a school in his life. Everything he knew about whales, he had learned himself by watching whales. So this is the fun stuff. These are all whales. And if I were to ask what you notice, what do you notice about any of these creatures? What's that? They are very fishy. That is 100% right. They were giant fish. The eyes are all really huge, which is also pretty interesting. I have one source that I'll talk about in a bit, and I bet some of you have looked directly into the eyes of whales. I can't because I get sick, but Icelanders said they have human eyes. And I bet some of you who have looked into the eyes of whales will recognize that same idea. So the eyes are giant, but they're always depicted as fish. The two on the far side are realistic depictions of whales. These two are monsters. And I want to talk about how we get to this point. So let me back up just for 1 minute. With respect to the realistic whales, and by realistic, I'm sort of tongue in cheek. What do I mean by realistic portraits of whales? Roman authors looked at whales in the 1st century and the 2nd century, and they said, okay, these are very big fish, but they're very different from fish because they don't have gills. So they must have mouths on their forehead. So we're sort of figuring out how all this works. And that's, you can sort of start to see where this man has a fire set up over the whale. They knew that whales' mouths were somewhere up there. They knew that whales weren't like fish because they gave live birth to their young. And lastly, there was something else that was really different about these animals than fish, and that was baleen. And they didn't know what the hell baleen was. It made no sense. So they thought it's either some kind of horn, which it kind of is, a keratinous material, or it is some sort of really impressive eyelash that comes out and covers over their eyes during storms. So eyelashes become the main way they explain baleen for a long time. That is the state of whale science until the 13th century. Big fish, live birth, gigantic eyelashes, and no gills. That's not great. But the other myth or the other identity of whales was that whales were monsters. Every European person knew this. Whales were dangerous. You only saw them out on the open ocean. And this knowledge is coming from Mediterranean people. They have toothed whales, they have dolphins, they have sperm whales, they don't have a lot of baleen whales. That is the Strait of Hormuz. The origin of the monster, thank you, yes, that is the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a political commentary. I'm a state employee, I'm not going to say anything about the Strait of Hormuz. The first reference to monstrous whales comes from Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great had crossed from Greece all the way over to India. He and his troops were coming back home, and he split his troops off. Some went by land, some went by sea. Those who went by sea encountered monstrous whales. In the 4th century BCE, and this is about the same time the Old Testament's being written. So Leviathan and Jonah, are also being written in this time. So we start to get these multiple sources talking about monsters. So that is a Greek ketos. The only words they had for whales were ketos or ketus, from which we get cetacean, and balena, from obviously we get balenidae, and physeter. Those are the Greek and Latin emendations, the words they had for whales. So these sailors, these Greek sailors, under Alexander the Great, were sailing through the Arabian Sea, about to get to the Straits of Hormuz, and these monsters appeared before them. In this foreign sea, there lived great whales and other large fish, much bigger than what we have. As we set sail, we observed water being blown aloft, almost like a natural force. We were terrified and asked our pilots, and these are local Indian pilots from the coast of the Makran, so all along this Arabian Sea coastline. We asked them what was happening, and they said, well, they're just whales. But the Greeks were absolutely terrified, dropped their oars, they probably dropped other things, and just stood stock still, terrified of these creatures. Probably sperm whales. It's hard to know from the description. So their response was to start to create a giant racket and then to row straight towards the whales, like a battle maneuver. The whales dove down, defeated. They surfaced later on behind the fleet. but they sailed on and avoided them. And that is the first story of the monstrous whales. That gets repeated for the next 1,000 years. These aggressive, monstrous creatures, bigger than anything we could imagine. By the time we get into Europe itself, this is from St. Ambrose of Milan. He lives in Italy in the 4th century. He says these animals appear not on the coast or shore, but way out in the depths of the Atlantic. So if you don't see these in the Mediterranean, don't be surprised. They are far deep ocean animals. They're of huge bulk, measureless size. If they were to float on the surface of the sea, you'd think they were islands or mountains, just so massive. And then we get to the most popular tradition in all of medieval Europe. And again, big fish, right? Big fish, that's all they look like. They've got the fins that are vertical and not horizontal. You also notice a couple of these giant whales have big open mouths and fish are swimming into them. So this document is the one that is most known throughout medieval Europe. If you were a Christian kid, you would have heard about this if you went to school. You would have heard about this in sermons. This is the monstrous whale come to Europe. And this whale has 2 tricks. I should mention bestiaries in general are big catalogs of animals. Every animal that God created has some message that God is sending to you through this animal. And the whale's a punisher. The whale is going to correct your sinful behavior. And it does this by testing in 2 ways. So each one of these shows a boat and sailors, very different periods, 13th century, 11th century, that sort of immaterial. But a boat of sailors out on the ocean sees this gorgeous island. And this island's covered in sand and trees. And these weary sailors think, we're just going to stop and take a rest. Whatever we have to do can wait. They anchor upon the whale. They set a cooking fire on the whale. They start to chill out. And then that whale, who is sent by God to punish the wayward, dives into the depths, dragging them to their deaths. It's telling you, it's testing you, do not stray from your correct path. And that's the purpose of the whale and the bestiary. And we can imagine most medieval Europeans knew this story. Before I move on from the bestiary, I had to show one other bestiary creature. I don't even know if you can you guess what this is? Any guesses as to what this delightful critter is? It has a local connection. This is an oyster. Is that not the most? So this is also instructive. Now, I know some of you have probably in your lifetimes had bad oysters. This is a bad oyster. I quiz my students often by showing them medieval animals from bestiaries. They're not very good at depicting animals, especially ones like whales that they really don't see much. Anyway, it's an absolute delight. Jonah is the same sort of creature, right? So Isidore of Seville from Spain, who does have proximity to whales. He could have seen whales more than Ambrose in Italy. Whales are immense beasts with bodies equal to mountains. They're called monsters because of their horribleness. The whale that swallowed Jonah was such a size, and its belly resembled hell. No matter where you went in a church, or you went to hear a sermon, or you just even looking at the art, these monstrous whales are everywhere. So the reason we've been investigating this idea of what medieval people thought, we want to know what the people at Hopnir thought, the people who used whales in Iceland thought. Is this what they thought whales were? The last behavior that we see in the bestiary, and this was published in Marine Mammal Science a few years ago, whales, to emphasize you shouldn't stray from your correct path, will open their mouths underwater and they will emit a sweet odor, and all these gullible fish will swim in. And it's been observed that this resembles trap feeding or surface treadwater feeding methods, as you see from this humpback. So what this tells us is somebody is actually observing whales. And they're recording it, but in a really mythologized way. So in asking this question, is this what medieval people really thought about whales? The answer is pretty much a resounding no. People who didn't see whales probably thought this about whales. At the same time that all these stories are being told, we've got coastal populations across Normandy and the Bay of Biscay, on the English coast. We get these tiny little references to a fisherman hauling in a whale, or we'll see a whale bone placed somewhere and it's been used. We know that they were eating whales and dolphins pretty regularly, and especially on Fridays, because whales come from the sea, so they're permitted meat to eat. So the lesson to all of this is there are some people who know what whales are, and they know they're not just monsters. The problem is they're not writing it down. So all these peoples who knew what whales were and knew they weren't out there to get you, they're these quiet, invisible peasant voices that we're not hearing. And those are the voices that we've been trying to figure out and to capture. And then we get to this guy. We get to a man named Albertus Magnus. He is the patron saint of natural science. He wrote 38 volumes, thousands and thousands of pages. He was the teacher of Thomas Aquinas. So he's got his props. He went to all sorts of universities across Europe, and he was a dedicated naturalist. He wrote a 2,000-page work called On Animals, and he's writing it sometime around 1260. So up until 1260, whales are big fish. They have these gigantic, beautiful eyelashes. They don't have gills. They give birth to live young, but they're mostly monstrous. And then everything changes with Albertus Magnus. He studies Aristotle. And if you studied Aristotle in the 13th century, the church was watching you. That meant you were willing to question authority. So the church already was sort of watching Albertus Magnus, but he loved nature. He wrote about philosophy and theology and all these things, but he loved nature. So he did something really interesting. He said, I'm not just going to read these Roman authors and these Greek authors. I'm going to go talk to fishermen. So we had a bunch of fishermen that he routinely interviewed on the coast of the North Sea, and they hooked him up. And with Albertus Magnus, we make this giant leap forward. So in De Animalibus, we get this insight that Albertus is willing to question authority. I've got to just read this because he says, with the massive size of whales, I didn't put this one on the screen, but when it comes to that massive size of whales that we see that look like mountains and islands, he says, I asked my fishermen and they said they've never seen anything like it. So there's a hole in this testimony of classical authors. So he listens more and more to his fishermen, and they tell him of whale Orcatus. This is a fish of many genuses. Two types are seen and captured in our North Sea. One has the opening of its mouth lined with very long teeth. He seems to have a little bit of confusion. He thinks walrus ivory comes from whales. So he talks about some whales having gigantic canine teeth, which thank God they don't have. But we imagine he's talking about sperm whales here. The other whale, and I think Keith will appreciate this, in our time, another genus has been seen on occasion. It has a mouth suited for sucking, right? Beaked whales suck. This genus was smaller than the other one, but had much better flesh. So with this, in 1260, Albertus Magnus recognizes we have toothed whales and baleen whales. So when Keith mentioned this morning, I thought, it takes 1,000 years for people to get to that point, which is sort of astounding. His fishermen take him to observe whale butchery. He never saw a living whale in his lifetime, which is somewhat astounding, but this will make a special sense in a moment. So they took him to watch a whale butchery. He describes a whale that is very dark, almost black in color, and has 250 pieces of eyelash on either side of its face, which sounds, from what I know, to be a right whale. He then goes on to talk about how the baleen starts wide where it's anchored and curves down to a curved scythe-like shape. Also pretty good, right? He's starting to actually observe this baleen. He cannot understand, and I'm sorry for the dead whale picture, but he cannot still understand how baleen works, having never seen a living whale. So he says it's eyelashes. He's not ready to make that jump because he's never seen any of them actually using baleen in the wild. Now, the next part of the Albertus Magnus story that gets pretty interesting also ties in with what we heard this morning. The fishermen tell him Well, we go out and hunt whales. If you want to come along with us, you can. We hunt whales in small groups. There are 3 of us in a boat. We take many boats. We're opportunistic, so if we see whales, we'll row out to where we think they'll surface. And one of us has a lance or a striking weapon with a cord through it. The fishermen tell him more often than not that whale escapes to sea. And then they say, we're really sad because we've just lost our weapons and we've lost all that rope because the whale takes it with him. Sometimes they'll go down to the bottom of the sea and try and rub the weapon out of their skin. But for most often, the fishermen lose the whale and their tackle, which is an interesting point to study. And I'll come back to that in a second. They also say whales strand here all the time. And when whales strand, local people go out, they take all the rope they can find and they tie it down and they attach it to houses and they attach it to rocks. When the tide comes up, those whales often go away. And the fishermen say, and all the local people lament because they've lost all that rope. There's one example of a whale that comes back, having stranded once. It comes back 3 days later into the fjord chasing herring, and it miraculously brings back all the rope because it's trailing the rope because it's entangled. So in 30 years of reading about whales, this is the first reference to an entanglement that I've seen. So already in the 13th century, we have whales traveling around that have been entangled. And that whale probably came back not because it was chasing herring, but because it couldn't swim anymore. So the locals were thrilled because they not only got the whale, but they got their rope back. They were especially happy they got the rope back. So what an advancement from the big fish with eyelashes, no gills, live birth. Suddenly we have toothed whales, we have entanglements. We're learning a lot more about whales. And then we move to Norway. And in Norway, we meet the author of the King's Mirror. The author of the King's Mirror probably lived in Bergen, Norway. He lived at the court of King Haakon IV. And he wrote this work called The King's Mirror, which is written in Old Norse. It's very colloquial, it's very conversational, it's very casual. And we think it was written for King Haakon's sons, who had just inherited Greenland and Iceland. Now that's a good dad. So Greenland and Iceland had just been added to the Kingdom of Norway. And the author of The King's Mirror kind of delightfully begins with all these wonders of Iceland. These aren't his drawings. He didn't draw. Nobody's drawing. The only drawings of whales we have are those monster whales. So in writing to these young princes about the land they're about to inherit, he describes the northern lights, he describes geysers, he describes volcanoes, he describes polar bears, and he spends a lot of time talking about polar bears. A lot of time talking about polar bears. And there's this delightful image at the bottom of a man hiding out in a hut. The fact that he obsesses so much about polar bears leads us to believe, boy, he was there. He was there, because if you have ever encountered a polar bear, you know you're in absolute peril. And this is in an age before marksmen and guns. So polar bears routinely show up in Iceland as well as Greenland in this period, by the way, and they still show up in Iceland today. So in this work, he is writing to these young princes. He says, of all the things in the oceans, aside from the whales, there is nothing worth mentioning or discussing. These whales vary both in kind and size. I should mention that he's writing in 1250, 10 years before Albertus Magnus. And he goes on to talk about all these different species. Without blinking, without any fanfare, he says pilot whales are constantly caught and driven to land by the hundreds. He says beaked whales are not fit to be eaten. The fat drawn from them cannot be digested. And I know when I've worked with beaked whale and bottlenose whale bones, they're incredibly oily. They seem to be more oily than other bones, and I'd be curious if other people have had the same experience. Fin whales would be great to eat, but they're protected. If you hunt a fin whale, you're going to be penalized by either a fine or exile. They're too helpful to fishermen. They show us where the schools of herring are. So already by the 13th century, they're protecting specific animals. Blue whales often fall prey to whale fishers. They're better for eating and smell better than any other fishes. Often fall prey to whale fishers. which we're still wrapping our heads around because that's what our project also tells us. There are 3 more that I want to briefly mention. He says right whales are dangerous because they approach ships so readily, and he says you can recognize them because they don't have a dorsal fin. And this sounds pretty good, right, compared to everything else we know, and these are pretty accurate. Humpback whales are dangerous because of their large pectoral fins. And if you're in a little boat, check. He says the bowhead whale is massive, its head is massive, and the baleen, he has the longest baleen that hangs from his mouth. So finally, the eyelash theory is gone. We have someone who has sailed these seas, has seen these whales. He then concludes by talking about the bestiary and says, that ain't a whale. He says, that's the kraken. So this Norwegian guy, writing in Old Norse, has overturned a millennium of thought about whales. And no one reads him if they're not Norwegian. That's it. He doesn't enter European thought. Now, other fishermen know his work, but fishermen already knew these things. So things are looking up. We have toothed whales, we have baleen whales, we've got species mentioned, we've got hunting methods, we've got entanglements mentioned. It seems like the 13th century is this revolutionary moment. And then the brakes slam on and we come screeching to an intellectual halt when we get to the Protestant Reformation. No offense to Luther. No offense to Luther. Sorry, I'm speaking for the YouTube people. The Protestant Reformation slows everything down. The next great author of whales is one that you've probably seen before. He leaves us this magnificent map in 1539. If you study whales in the pre-modern world, you can't not study Olaus Magnus. So poor Olaus Magnus was an archbishop in Protestant Sweden, which means he was exiled from his homeland. And for him, the world is crashing down. His world experienced multiple waves of Black Death. His world experienced the Little Ice Age. His world was animated by God, and he knew God was unhappy with the world. And there's one thing that God does when he's unhappy, and that means he sends whales, which is why the entire western side of this map is covered with angry, monstrous whales. Like Albertus Magnus, Olaus Magnus, and he ain't sainted, he's not a saint, but Olaus Magnus had Norwegian fishermen as expert witnesses. And sometimes you see their testimony. We almost never hear it. Olaus can't not write about monsters. But as we look at his map, we start to see little traces of things that start to make sense. So in the bottom of the map near Thule, we see this whale who's labeled Balaena. Balaena is thought to be a female whale. Catus was always the male, Balaena means it's female. And if you can look closely, she's got a little baby whale latched on. She's nursing. So at some point, the fishermen, and Olaus, like Albertus, never saw a living whale. He tells us he doesn't like to go out on sea. So we have a baleen whale feeding her young, and we have an orca predating upon her. Ignore the whale with all the eyes. To the north. We'll come back to those. We have two ships, a ship and 2 whales to the south of Iceland. That at the top of the map is Iceland. These are baleen whales with those dual blowholes. So the fishermen recognize that. Very different than the giant fish. And you can tell just by glancing, very different. You can also see things that look like canine teeth poking up. That's baleen. So it's not an eyelash now, but it's still not working as it should. And finally, we've got a scene of the Faroe Islands. And we've got a whale attached to the shore. He's anchored to the shore. And men are busily, another baleen whale, men are busily butchering him. And a big floating pile of ambergris is seen over to the east. So these are all details that somebody who doesn't go to sea wouldn't have been able to muster on his own. This is all testimony of these learned fishermen. But the monsters are still there. The island whale is still there. These monstrous horned whales are still over here by Norway. So Olaus has access to science. He has access to Albertus Magnus. He just doesn't listen to it. Off on the coast in Norwegian Sea are monsterfish with strange names reckoned to be species of whale. They say you can view whales in the Atlantic Deep, where sight of them dissuades mariners from bold voyages through terror of meeting their end. He also concludes in a second work that he writes, a very long work that's a description of the northern world. Every time his fishermen try to explain to him about hunting or stranded whales, he focuses on the terrors of the animals that they encounter. His great contribution to science is the depiction of whales. And speaking of depiction of whales, the last person I want to mention is the hero of the story, Jan Lerdi Gudmundsson. He drew himself in a cute little 16th century selfie, which is sort of lovely. He looks like he could be a barista in Asheville where I live. I mean, he is this precocious, pretentious little guy. And he left us this. And if you want to talk about a great leap forward, that's it. All of a sudden, those monstrous whales are completely gone. And you could, and I know you could do this, you could go down even without the names and the captions and the sizes, which he also provides, start to recognize these animals. This comes from his mind alone. And this is science. What's notable about John the Learned, or Jan Lerdi as he's called, he was born 35 years after Olaus published that map with all the monstrous whales. He lived about 150 miles from the archaeological site we work on, and he was alive when that site was active. So we're using John as a proxy for knowledge. We think our fishermen probably knew about as much about whales as John did. Now I should mention and I should add that John is from a Catholic family. He comes from a family of churchmen. He called the Protestant Reformation a catastrophe of darkness and never mentioned it again. So he was not hung up like Olaus Magnus was. He wrote extensively. He obviously drew extensively, both whales and other creatures that I'll show you. He never went to school. He read voraciously. Iceland has a culture of extraordinary learning and extraordinary poverty. They would pass books along to each other, copy them, and then they'd move on. So it doesn't matter if you're a peasant or elite, you are literate as a child. Your parents teach you to read in Iceland from the Middle Ages up through the early modern period. He is a peasant, he is a fisherman, he is a farmer, he is a whaler. He is also a sorcerer. He is also a runesmith. He writes a book about when the elves were created. He says before Eve was created, I don't know how to say this politely, Adam by himself created elves. I'll just leave it at that, and you can think about that what you will. Adam is responsible for the creation of elves. You can imagine the church didn't like this idea very much, and we'll come back to that. He comes from the West Fjords in Iceland, which is also incredibly important for this story. That is a wild and outlawry sort of center of the Icelandic world. There is a museum of sorcery there today, and it is exactly from the town where he comes from. The other important thing about him being from the West Fjords is that while he lived there, Basque whalers had set up shop there, and he knew them, and he talked to them, and he watched them. And it's likely some of the animals he drew, he had access to because of these Basque whalers. He is also a bone worker and a tooth carver. He says walrus ivory's okay, but whale bone and whale tooth are much better. And we think this is his ink pot. We're not sure, but it has a merman, and he writes a lot about mermen. So this is the West Fjords, this jutting out peninsula. This is from NASA. All those pink captions are places Jan lived. And that underscores his poverty. He has to constantly move. It also underscores the fact that he gets into trouble a lot, and he is forced out of the West Fjords. So then he has to move to Snæfellsnes. And then he's forced out of Snæfellsnes, and he has to move to Reykjanes. I show you this NASA image because the western part of Iceland is the richest feeding ground for Iceland. So he would have seen whales all the time. And these are the places that he lived. Not bad if you've got to be exiled. So Jan knew monstrous whales existed, but he knew the difference between monsters and whales. So he wrote about a group of whales called the Illkvelli, the evil whales. That is another set of drawings of whales that Jan left for us. He kind of isolates these animals and says, you don't really see them. He actually says, I never see them. I think they all died in 1602. And as an author, this is a pretty convenient little thing. Like, I'm not going to talk about whales, these monstrous whales, because they're all dead now, so don't worry. But these whales did exist, the red comb and the flap whale. The way these whales are described in mythology, a modern artist has reproduced them sort of with the exaggerated features that the texts show. So those evil whales are problematic, but they're not really whales. He goes on to tell us, based on his cultural tradition, that sometimes whales can be controlled by witches. So don't be surprised if you see a couple witches riding on a whale. The whales are cool. The whales, it's not their fault. It's the witches have taken control of them. He says sometimes sorcerers or bad kings from Scandinavia will transform into whales and come down to Iceland to mess with us. And then occasionally a good king will shapeshift into a whale, and you can tell because they've got friendly eyes. So he tells the difference between real whales and these mythological whales. There's some idea that whalebone itself has a supernatural power to it. And the fact that Jan worked in whalebone kind of gives, and runes and elves, kind of gives him a bad reputation. And this bad reputation. In 1615, he witnessed the slaughter of 31 Basque whalers. The Basques had set up shop in the West Fjords of Iceland after the Newfoundland, Labrador whale fishery dried up. They were good neighbors. They often gave whales that they didn't, minke whales, small whales, to local peasants to feed them. So they were appreciated by some, but they were Catholic, they were foreign language speakers, and they were thought to be taking Iceland's property. So other Icelanders didn't appreciate these Basques. A very bad lawman named Arni Magnusson led the slaughter of 31 Basques who had been shipwrecked in 1615. And Jan, being Jan, wrote a testimony and said that sheriff did dirty to the Basques and he should be punished for this. And in 1615, that letter, that testimony forced Jan into exile. So he moves to Snæfellsnes. But his troubles followed him. In 1627, he wrote a work, 2 poems written in Icelandic here. These 2 poems were ghost exorcism poems, that the strongest exorcism poems ever in Iceland, and they worked, but he must be in league with the devil. So they exiled him from Snæfellsnes. He lands in Reykjanes, which is close to Keflavik Airport if you ever make your way to Iceland. And at that point, he's written one more work about runes and spells. And the Icelanders say, that's it. You're exiled from Iceland completely. So Jan goes to Copenhagen. He's going to appeal to Copenhagen, which the Danish crown now controls Iceland and Greenland, taken over from Norway. And he meets a man named Ole Worm. And Worm named everything after himself, including his own museum, the Museum Wormianum. It was a cabinet of curiosities. And Ole Worm was a great academic, and he was really elite. And when Jan shows up, this peasant fisherman from Iceland, Worm wasn't particularly impressed until he saw the whales. This sheet of whales was commissioned by Ole Worm from Jan, and it was preserved in Copenhagen, and it becomes part of the Museum Wormianum. And it's the most realistic set of whales we'd seen to this point in Europe. What's interesting about the sheet, if you go, you can make out those 2 whales, second and third on this row. Those are 2 species of right whales. He also draws 2 species of blue whales. And Jan's pretty savvy, so we're still trying to figure out if this is a European population and an American population of right whales, and we really don't know what's going on with the blue whales, because fin whales are also there, sei whales are there, etc. He comes back from Copenhagen, back home in the 1630s. He can never go home to the West Fjords, so he ends his life in the East Fjords of Iceland. And he turns to what he loves the most, which is whales and nature. He writes the natural history of Iceland. And it is birds and rocks and soil and insects. It is all the things he loves. Marine mammals and sea creatures fascinate him. So you see here urchins and eels, a tiny little sea cucumber, which is absolutely delightful. And then the whales. Sperm whales, gray whales, all of the favorites. Not everything he illustrated in Copenhagen is here, but many of them are. It is about a 35-page work, and whales comprise about a quarter of it, a full quarter of it. So he says, and I don't want to go into too much detail, he talks about all the species from the smallest to the largest. He talks about their size, what they look like, their market value, and then he gives unique descriptions. He says killer whales, blue whales, and right whales have 2 populations each. He says beaked and bottlenose whales, and we're still trying to figure out which whale he's talking about. We think it might be a Sowerby's whale. He says they are inedible because of their oiliness, but their teeth are really good for carving. He says a beaked whale tooth is better for carving than any walrus ivory, and I've tested this myself. He says the sperm whale has a remarkable and very different skull, and its teeth are pretty good for working. The gray whale, he says, lies about in the sand. The gray whale's still there in 1646. So this is a helpful marker for when the gray whale eventually goes away. He says the right whale, shown over on the left, is found in 2 populations, one about 45 feet, one 60 feet. And he says there's a very large number of these whales, but foreign whalers have reduced this species the most. He goes on to talk about the length of baleen of humpbacks, minkies, fin whales with some accuracy. And then finally, there's this whale, the Hofferkiti. We don't know which one this is. It's some kind of rorqual whale. What's notable about this is he says, it's like a fin whale. It's beautiful to look at. I have observed a white rose pattern and multi-armed stars and branches and threads in between when this whale has been butchered, which my colleagues think is Ratia, mirabilia, this complex network, which other people here can explain better than I can, of arteries and veins. So he is looking that deeply into the bodies of the whales. And that is science as much as I've seen it. Jan's work is never translated, which is why many of us don't know about Jan. A later author takes that description of that whale with all those stars, and that's how he renders it. So Jan's words don't make it, but his images do. Finally, he talks about blue whales, and again says, my family are blue whale hunters. He said calves will routinely come to the same parts with their mother calves will bring their mother whales will bring their calves to the same fjords routinely. So he knows blue whales exceptionally well. So I go back to my bone workers at Hafnir in northern Iceland. What did they think as they were using the whales? They think everything that Jan is saying. They have depth and complexity and emotion. They appreciate the animals. They think they're beautiful. They don't believe they're monsters. So if I don't consider all these things when we're thinking about our evidence, I'm reducing these fishermen to nothing more than whalers who don't care about their animals. And they did. They cared a lot about the whales, and they watched them as closely as we do. So thank you for listening. I know that was a lot of medieval history.